This is part two of our lecture for week two. And we've been tracing the history today of a sort of a series of controversies through the 1970s with the difficulties of the world economy, into a sort of a return of beggar thy neighbor politics in the 1970s, 1980s, the arrival of Thatcher and her long shadow over the European Union in her time in office. But and I'm going to jump over some stuff here that your book will go into more detail on. But we had just been sort of talking about Thatcher sort of catastrophically losing the prime ministership in the 90s, and John Major coming in as the new British prime minister. Same party, same conservative party, but definitely a little bit less Europhobic, if I may use the term. He did sort of share some of Thatcher's positions, sort of a general terror of any use of the so-called F word, federalism, but certainly sort of less striking, less shrieking maybe in his rhetoric about the European Union, and of course his backbenchers not liking him very much for that, but nevertheless he's got a pretty strong grip on the office when he comes in. Now, Thatcher out of the way, I guess you guys might see this as a repeating pattern. We've got to get rid of de Gaulle, and now we have to get rid of Thatcher. Well, Thatcher's out of the way now, and so there's some scope or space for a bit more development. And so the hope of people like Delors was that they could now introduce something that would be a kind of a rebranding, a relaunching, a remodeling of the European Union. And this was going to come in the form of a kind of a replacement document for the treaties of Rome, otherwise known as a companion document, maybe might be a better way to put it, but it's going to take us to the next step of what was envisioned in the treaties of Rome. And it's going to have three pillars. So try to think of a building with three pillars in it, and the roof is standing on these three pillars. And that's how maybe is the best way to imagine how these people, these new visionaries, these new founding fathers, if you will, are going to be thinking about what the European Union is going to look like from here on in as we move into a more complicated era. And so there's, of course, the area of the European Union that we've always sort of known and loved and understood, and that's going to be under Pillar 1, the European communities. In this area, you're going to have something called a community method, which is going to be applied to anything to do with economic, social, or trade matters. And here, the council is going to have this traditional sort of QMV, but you'll need to have about 71% of the votes in order to get your agenda turned into policy. And then one big issue where there's going to be a major advance in that sphere where the community method applies is the institution of citizenship in the form of European Union passports. So everyone now, instead of having an Irish passport or a British passport or what have you, is going to have an EU passport. So that's a big kind of symbolic step. It is a symbolic step, but it's also going to cut some red tape. It's going to allow for a greater facility of ease of movement between the countries of the European Union. So that's the kind of thing you can expect to see in Pillar 1. Now, Pillar 2 and Pillar 3 are a little bit different, and they're new for the TEU. They're going to be new competencies added to the body of law already established under the Treaty of Rome. And the first pillar there is going to be concerned with security and defense. It's sort of an area we traditionally consider to do with high politics as opposed to low politics. But there's going to be space here now for a common diplomatic framework and for a common structure of actions that the European Union can sort of engage in now, harmonized and new powers to for the European Union to be an actor in the sphere of diplomacy, which it hasn't really had up to this point in time. The European Union is an intergovernmental body, really, sort of in the high political sense up to this time. So that's going to be new. And then also there's going to be a third pillar, which is going to be to do with cooperation in the fight against crime. And so we're going to be seeing major leaps forward in the sense of trying to implement a European kind of policing strategy. So those are the three major pillars. Now, separately to the main TEU document, you're going to have two protocols attached. These are secondary documents, but in those documents is going to be great things being sort of mentioned, described, and implemented. And one of them is the European currency. And it's going to take place following a three-stage plan. And it must be said, of course, that this three-stage plan is going to be very controversial. Number one, from 1990 to December 1993, you're going to have a period where there's going to be completely free circulation of capital, and that's to say, your financial assets and what have you. And that's despite the fact that the countries in question are still going to have their own currencies. So you can imagine that would maybe be an original situation, and possibly one that the nation states have not fully thought through in terms of any unexpected bumps in the road. We'll get back to that in a second. The second stage is going to be up to January 1999. To that point in time, you're going to have a bunch of convergence criteria, reduction of inflation, interest rates, control of government deficit, fluctuation margins. That's going to sound pretty painful for a lot of countries, especially if they already have a lot of sort of government policies in place that might be producing inflation. It's not exactly always easy to control that, but usually you do it through interest rates, and of course usually there's an impact in terms of consumption in your country, and so if you're trying to develop economically, that can be very constraining. And then there's also this question of government deficit. Again, if you're trying to grow your way out of a recession, for example, or develop your way out of being a poor country to a wealthy country, like countries like Greece might have been trying to do, then centralized control of your government deficit is going to be hard. And then thirdly, from January 1st, 1999 to January 1st, 2002, you're going to have the establishment of this major new institution. And that is the institution of the European Central Bank, which is going to replace the central banks of all the major countries, major or otherwise, just all the member states, and fix the exchange rates and introduce to them a single currency. How is this document going to fare? Because of course it's going to be a new body of law that supplements the Rome Treaty, so it's going to have to be ratified. There's controversy there, and I'm going to bring up on the screen here a new character in our midst, and that's a famous guy, often thought of as someone who's friends with Hillary Clinton. I don't know where that idea comes from, frankly, but anyway, back in this particular time in history, George Soros was not a known figure, but and he is of course a known figure today, but George Soros then is a Hungarian financier, and he is a currency speculator. And he's basically kind of a Robin Hood figure. He wants to steal, so to speak, from the rich and give to the poor. And he's going to do it through currency speculation, perfectly legal, I might add. And he's going to really make a killing at this early experimental time where the European sort of phase one of the European currency project is going to be in place. Now we've said already that that phase one from 1990 to 1993 is going to be one where where capital products can move freely within the European Union. Now, in September 1992, and for the next several months, Soros is going to lead a team of speculators to try to exploit this new development and to extract a lot of value from trying to manipulate the British pound sterling. And in that sense, he's going to take on the Bank of England. The Bank of England will have currency reserves, but if George Soros is borrowing in future markets pounds and dumping pounds that he's borrowed in the future in the present, I know that sounds really weird. It's not like Back to the Future here. We're not actually talking literal time travel. It's going to be very hard for me to explain what currency speculation is if you don't already know, if you haven't maybe taken an economics class. But if you know or you're familiar with arbitrage, or you're familiar with the economic concept of speculation or future trading, and then that's really kind of what we're talking about here. It's where you have the option to go to a bank and borrow from that bank a number of British pound sterling, say for example, and say the bank will have different markets. It has a market where you're borrowing overnight, a market where you're borrowing 10 years out and you want to sort of repay that money, but it's not due. It's not going to be due for 10 years. So sometimes you can get different economic deals depending on what term the money you're borrowing is for. But one advantage of borrowing in a very distant future market is that if you believe that the currency you're borrowing in is overvalued, then you can take large amounts of money borrowed in the future and dump it in the market in the present, creating a glut of that currency in the present markets, so that the value of that currency might come under pressure then, because supply and demand, whenever there's more supply of something, relatively there's less demand for it. So the British central bank is under pressure here to stay within the so-called ERM, which I haven't said much about because it's kind of a technical idea. But if you can imagine a band wherein currency fluctuation is required to stay relatively fixed, that's the rules of the ERM as the European Union currencies are moving closer and closer together to try to create this point where they can leap off and create the euro. But to maintain that value, when your currency is under attack by speculators and the value of it is under pressure to come down, you're going to have to take money, reserves from your central bank, and use that money to buy up your surplus cash. That is to say, take gold, take silver, and buy the cash, the paper money, back out of the market so that that glut disappears and the supply and demand of the currency is restored to where it was before. Now, Soros is betting that he can borrow more money in those future markets and dump it in the present market than the Bank of England has access to in terms of its reserves. And it's a whoever will blink first scenario, like a game of chicken. But of course, what Soros knows is that the UK is bound to the exchange rate mechanism, and he's of a mind that so long as that's the case, and Britain hasn't realized that its economy isn't really capable of institutionally backing that up with deeds, not just words, he has an opportunity here. So he goes for it, and eventually the UK and Italy, which is another very affected country, but not the famous case is the UK here. How George Soros took on the Bank of England, and it was because of the ERM and the fact that the UK had to keep its currency of a certain fixed value within the bandwidth of the ERM, that Soros was able to pull this off. So this creates a lot of fear in and around the Maastricht Treaty at this very vulnerable time when it is when they're seeking to implement it. Because it's being these different pillars that we spoke about earlier on are trying to be passed and ratified at a time when this Euro protocol is already in place. So Soros is sort of leading this attack in September 1992. Now, earlier that year in 1992, Denmark had rejected the TEU in a popular referendum. France, in September 1992, just as Soros is starting his attack, it narrowly passes, the French people narrowly pass the referendum with 51.05% in favor. That's very, very slight. And then you're into this kind of chaotic period of time into 1993, where the UK and Italy are obviously under tremendous pressure and have to leave the ERM. There's some realization then that Britain, that Denmark, countries like that who've sort of taken fright and aren't going to be easily bought into the Maastricht Treaty are going to have to be mollified somehow. And so there's a series of exceptions created where certain aspects of policy are not going to have to apply to those countries. And then it's put back to the Danish people in May 1993 and they ratify it. But it's a very different treaty now for them than it was beforehand. So all that to sort of say that this new rebranding or new relaunch of the European Union project is not exactly off to a flying start. So just two more slides to go today, guys. First of all, then, we're kind of now definitely entering more contemporary territory. We're entering into the 1990s, and then the theme of the 1990s might be said to be one of public unease and political overreach. And why might that be so? Well, I think because by now the impact of the European project is truly being felt in the daily lives of the average person. To my parents' generation, my parents are 70 now, so in the 50s and 60s, 70s even maybe, the European Union isn't showing up in their everyday lives. But by reaching stage 3 of the convergent process in the euro, and the development of the euro and the rollout of the euro, there's real impact being felt in people's lives. Because to get to stage 3 of the euro, you have to pass all the criteria of stage 2, which involves getting your national debt sorted out. And if you're going to have to get your national debt sorted out, as I was saying before, or implying before in the previous slide, that's going to require you to, possibly, cut your government spending, probably cut your government spending, right? And so what gets cut when government spending gets cut? Often it's the welfare programs. And so this strict criteria on national debt is certainly not going to be easy for peripheral countries like Ireland, like Greece, because these are countries that are maybe not as developed as the sort of core European industrial economies like Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, etc. Nevertheless, I think planners all over the European Union realized that if countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland were not included in the euro project, the overall currency would not have a lot of legitimacy, and it would perhaps even undermine the legitimacy of the EU overall, because it would appear that a select tier of elite European economies were kind of moving on and forming their own currency, leaving the other nation states behind. So, for this euro project not to undermine the legitimacy of the overall project, it had to be inclusive. And of course, as we discussed earlier on, those German car manufacturers really wanted to be able to have access to cheap labor in Spain and Portugal. So they would definitely be seeing an economic advantage to to having the euro as well, to having Greece and Spain and Portugal, Ireland in the euro. A couple of other really important developments in the 1990s that really can't be exaggerated. Unexpectedly, we had where we had, in fact, a peaceful transition from Cold War Soviet era for many Eastern European countries. Czech and Slovak Republic had separated, for example, relatively peacefully. That peaceful separation, that peaceful transition was not going to be repeated in Yugoslavia, which was going to go through a radical upheaval in the 1990s, initially with Croatian independence declared in 1991. Now, the EU was very hesitant to recognize and embrace a total fragmentation of Yugoslavia into a multitude of tiny nations. Like, they were not, for example, very keen to recognize Bosnia diplomatically. But the United States was very much in favor of all the nations, constituent nations of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia being recognized. And so the European Union kind of grudgingly had to go along with it. But of course, it was about to create a very bitter civil war. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that right now, but just for your interest, it's definitely something that, you know, overshadows this period of European integration. We also have to consider the fact that following the collapse of the USSR, you're going to have a wave of new nations lining up to join the European Union. In fact, 12 countries. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, a number of Balkan countries, Bulgaria, etc. So these are all going to be kind of lining up to join. 10 countries of that 12 were former Soviet bloc. So how is this going to be handled by the European Union? I mean, according to the criteria, these countries cannot exactly be rejected. I mean, they're within the domain of Europe, so it's definitely they're European countries, and the rules say so long as their economy looks good and so long as their politics are relatively democratic, they can pass the test and they can join. So a lot of conservatives and even some liberals in Europe are starting to wonder, is this going to be a good idea to expand to these countries? They have a lot of cheap labor. Polish labor is very, very cheap and numerous. And so you have to wonder, like, if the Poles are able to farm potatoes with that cheap labor, they'll be producing potatoes at about 1/5 of the price of an Irish potato or a French potato. What's that going to be doing for our agriculture? There's also a question of what to do about Turkey. Turkey is an interesting country because part of it is located in Europe. If you're familiar with the Bosphorus, there's a sort of a brief land separation, or little land separation there between Turkey, Asian Turkey, and European Turkey. But there's a substantial part of Turkey that is on the continent of Europe. And so is Turkey a European country or not? I won't comment too much about that. I've actually written about this topic before with some colleagues, and I'm happy to send you my research on that if you want, and we might do a special lecture on that later in the class if you guys are interested. But for now, simply suffice to say that the question of whether Turkey is European or not is controversial for a lot of people, and there's a genuine worry, whatever about Polish farmers undermining European agriculture, there's a genuine worry about a flood of Turkish immigrants coming into the European Union and undermining the price of labor and that kind of thing. But tangentially, I mean, the population of Europe is aging, so you're going to need young workers if Europeans are not having children at the rate necessary to replenish the population. if Europe has entered what some people sometimes call a post-industrial population phase, where are you going to get young people to man the factories? So that's a really important question. There's a number of other things I could add here, in the late 90s and moving into the 2000s that are worth mentioning. I'll just mention a handful here. One very important topic is the Edith Cresson scandal. Now, Edith Cresson was a commissioner in Brussels, and she was really sort of exposed as being very corrupt in 1998. And for the first time ever, the European Parliament, which, as you know, has now directly elected members, is expressing a power that it has. It's usually a pretty powerless organization. Many people, to this point in time, sort of thought of it as a talking shop, but it did have, and it still has, the power to veto the European Commission's budget. And so reviewing the budget, it comes across these very bizarre sort of spending patterns in Edith Cresson's office, and calls in the entire commission because it has the power to hold the commission and sanction the commission, to actually force it to resign, to fire it, if things if it's deemed necessary. Cresson won't apologize. She won't budge. She won't resign, and so the entire commission goes down. And it is, the end of an era. Jacques Santer, who'd replaced Delors, is the head commissioner at this point in time, and he has to step down. And it's a very black moment in the history of the institutions of the European Union, and further confirmation, I think, in the eyes of many Eurosceptics, that this sort of notion of these shadowy, unelected bureaucrats who are corrupt and lining their own pockets actually sometimes holds some genuine water. We should talk a little bit about the Nice Treaty and how the Irish rejected it in a referendum in June 2001. Largely, I would add to your comments that are made in your textbook. I would think that it's important to mention that your textbook doesn't mention this, but one of the reasons why Irish people may have rejected the Nice Treaty was because it seemed to be making substantial noises towards building something like a European army. And of course, Ireland is historically a neutral nation that, it is not an armed nation. It has a very sort of small, modest defense force. It doesn't take part in wars except at the behest of the UN on peacekeeping missions. I could go into more detail on that, but I'll pass just for the minute. Just to suffice to say that the specter of Irish soldiers being sort of invited and asked to fight alongside NATO soldiers somewhere really just put people off. So that had to be clarified for the Irish people, and subsequently then they did accept it. We also had another rejection of a major European treaty in 2005, which is very important to consider on our way to an account of the euro, and that is the Constitutional Treaty, which in reality was an effort to set out a clearer sense of which powers were belonging to the nation states and which were belonging to the European Union. But it also envisioned something called a president figure, a president of the European Union. Well, technically a president of the European Council, but this would have effectively sort of constituted an executive branch, or a prototype of an executive branch, because the European Council, of course, is the executive of the European Union. To have a president would have been kind of seen as a major step towards developing a European sovereignty, and also the appointment of an EU foreign minister. Now, of course, we've made this distinction between high politics and low politics before. To have a European foreign minister, an actual foreign minister who you can pick up and call on the phone, where the European Union didn't really have that beforehand and didn't have a foreign policy position, or at least an actor who could speak in terms of a European foreign policy. This was going to be a major, major step, and also an intimidating step, you can imagine, for some people. They were also planning to get rid of the qualified majority vote system and have a whole other new system come in that was going to be based on what they called a double majority principle. Double majority would be this idea that you had to get a majority of both states and the overall population to vote for something if it was going to exist. So it would have really sort of democratized and empowered the ordinary people of Europe to vote on major steps forward as a whole European polity, as opposed to Irish people, Polish people, whatever. They would all be participating in a sort of a referendum together, and you would have been able to bypass then, I think, this need for referendums in various countries, or at least you would have had a sense that it was a referendum that everyone was participating in. Maybe that creates a sense of solidarity, I don't know. But all combined, this really had sort of makings of a European superstate in the eyes and hearts of some, and it was rejected by France and the Netherlands, and so therefore it was unable to put in place for quite some time. We do have an EU foreign minister today, and I think it's safe to say that the idea of a president of the European Council has evolved further as well. But I think we're still kind of slowly moving towards getting rid of QMV. Now, my final slide for today, last but not least, to bring us up to speed with the readings, where you guys are in your readings this week. I'm just going to say some brief things about the financial crisis in Europe, because really we're going to be spending a lot of time this semester talking about Stiglitz, talking about Varoufakis, reading these wonderful books. These supplemental readings we'll be dealing with, I think, primarily in our exchanges in the discussion boards, but I'll chime in on them here in my lectures wherever I can. And what do we need to know about the euro crisis? Then, well, the euro crisis is associated with the dramatic turn of events that took place in 2008 as a global credit crunch hit world markets, as a knock-on effect from the collapse of housing markets in Cleveland and Detroit, which itself was the result of the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States in 2008, September 2008. And this collapse of Lehman Brothers didn't just affect Cleveland and Detroit housing markets. It also was sort of arrived in the form of a credit crunch or a financial tsunami that impacted Europe as well. This is because, of course, many European funds would have been invested in Wall Street finance banks, and those were the banks where the crisis really started. But the crisis in Europe was a lot more serious than the one that affected the United States. Now, of course, the one that affected the United States was somewhat serious too. I can remember well in 2008 when I started my job at OU, reading the newspaper and just seeing sort of the figures on foreclosures, Florida, Cleveland, Detroit, as I mentioned. A lot of ordinary people lost their homes. But there was a sense in which the United States, as one federal country with an overarching tax and spend capacity in the country, could sort of implement a spending plan to create stimulus and compensate for the negative impact of the banking collapse to a certain extent on jobs and on consumption, and sort of lighten the impact of the crisis somewhat. But it was and it still remains, I think, we're still living in the aftermath of that in the United States, and we can't, jobs have recovered in the United States, but certainly it would be hard to argue that that the jobs have come back with salaries as high as they used to be. So in Europe, and so America's come through it rather well, that all said, even though those problems do exist. But in Europe, the problem has been a lot worse, and that's possibly because um, the crisis, when it hit, exposed not only the fiscal difficulties of dealing with such a crisis when you only have a common currency but not a common taxation and not a common tax spending apparatus or institution at the federal level, as the United States does. But also, you have constituent countries which were in different stages of economic development. Some of them were heavily in debt, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, and especially Greece. Greece was certainly, as a country, was in a lot of debt. Whereas Spain, Portugal, Ireland had private sector actors that were in a lot of debt, like banks. So there are subtle differences in how the different countries, were sort of economically prepared for and challenged to handle such a crisis. Um, Once it hit Europe, these countries, had such a huge amount of debt. Spain, Portugal, Ireland, because they had to bail out their banks. Greece, because it already had debt. That the credit crunch was going to make it very, very difficult for them to continue without some kind of a bailout. And so the result was a coordinated bailout strategy championed by the European Union, the European Union's central bank, the ECB as we called it last slide, and the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. And so together, these three institutions brokered a bailout strategy for these faltering European Union countries. Now, it must be said that, for these institutions, especially the IMF, to come in and have to sort of deal with modern, developed, industrially developed nations like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, it was historically unprecedented. I think with one or two exceptions, like Britain in the context of the ERM crisis we were talking about a moment ago. This really hasn't happened in the Northern Hemisphere. This is something that way more frequently is associated with third world countries. So that's just to sort of give you a sense of the gravity and of the situation and the impact of the debt crisis. Now, has it worked? I think the initial bailout of the Greek economy certainly seemed to work, but there needed to be a second one there subsequently to that. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Irish one, definitely Ireland was seen as a risky prospect. The government had nationalised one of the major commercial banks that had, really lied about its position, lied about its debts, and so the government had to step in and take it over, basically, turn it into a publicly owned concern. And it also had to guarantee the deposits of two other major banks, and that just really put a small country like Ireland, just all of a sudden, over 100% of its GDP or something was on the hook to buy out these banks. So it owed a huge amount of money, having done that. So one of the sort of penalties that the European Union institutions have imposed on the PIGS, the PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, is austerity. And austerity is going to be the focus of the book you'll be reading by Mark Blyth, whose arguments can be summarized basically as saying that you cannot cut your way out of a recession. You should use fiscal policy to create stimulus, much as we were saying. This is how the US got out of the Great Depression, for example. But the point is the EU doesn't have its own means for doing that, and so voters in leading economic nations like Germany, understand that for the EU to have that, it would cost Germans more than it would cost, say, Irish people. And so Germans realize that they'd be the ones reaching in their pockets for it, and so they don't want it, and they won't vote for it. And so people like Angela Merkel, who's the German chancellor, Angela Merkel won't be able to advocate those policies publicly because she knows that they won't be popular at home. Um, so we're now getting into the reason why austerity exists and why the European response to the financial crisis is so different to the American one. Because you have interstate politics in Europe in a way you don't have it in the United States. Um, because a properly sort of a properly thought through plan for a European stimulus isn't really possible in Europe. The only alternative is to sort of turn back around to the nations that are in debt and sort of point at them accusingly and talk about their need to be responsible citizens and to cut their debts and to basically pursue what's called austerity. And, even in 2010, there were people already commenting on the fact that there would probably need to be about 10 years of austerity, maybe more, in order just to sort of break even on this thing. And the debts probably will be owed to future generations, so it won't just be this generation paying the debts, it'll be, their children's children's children paying the debts, and so that really is kind of like classical third world style economic collapse. This is something that Europeans haven't often had to deal with. But that's the reality, right? If you don't have an option to create a European stimulus, if you don't have the institutional capacity to do that, then invariably people like Angela Merkel are going to be forced, because their voters won't give them any other choice, to turn around and start blaming these peripheral pigs, PIGS countries, for their lack of self-discipline, for having put us all in this situation, and for having put the euro in danger, as she said. So in this sense, then, the debate about austerity at the European level really has been a debate about, almost like between parents and their naughty little children, right? They're wagging their finger and saying, that the cause of the financial crisis has been not just any old debt, but the fact that the citizens of those countries have not been economically responsible enough. Now, I think a huge point here that cannot be overstated, and it'll be a point that you'll see made in the Varoufakis book when you read it, is that while this finger wagging at the pig countries is going on, the irony is that the money that these countries borrowed all came from German banks in the first place. Like, especially in Ireland, for example, there was a housing boom going on in Ireland, and that was the cause of I'm from Ireland, so I say our, haha. But anyway, the Irish banks were going into a very over-leveraged position vis-a-vis these development projects. And at the time it was happening, people thought that it was a great idea because Ireland seemed to be doing so well economically. So German banks, they have a hard time making money for their pension funds. Germans themselves are kind of slow consumers. They're not the type of people that generally go out and buy the next iPod or iPhone whenever it comes out, right? They're kind of a little bit sensible with their money, God bless them, and they save their money and they put it in their pension fund, as they should. But that leaves German banks in a position, because there's nowhere domestically that they can invest that pension money in order to make a return on it, and therefore to fulfill the bargain of the pension fund in the first place, which is to make money for the pensioners. and so that by the time they retire, that there's savings and interest and compounded interest all there waiting for them in the manner that they were hoping when they put their pensions there in the first place. So what are the German banks with these pension funds to do? They look around Europe and they try to see where the action is, where the hot action is, and Ireland was the Irish property market, the Spanish and Portuguese property markets were definitely places where there was a lot of hot action going on. Um, so that's the irony, is that it's German money that poured into these nations, these pig nations. But I use the term irony in an unapologetic manner because well, what's the first rule of capitalism? It really is this example of capitalism sometimes preaching one thing and practicing another, right? So if these so-called capitalists had pursued their ideology through, they would have not made the Irish citizens nationalize their banks. They would have had the Irish banks tell the German banks to whom they owed money, look, your investments that we were brokering for you have failed. And now you've got to eat the dirt because they were bad investments, right? And if you make a bad investment, you lose. If you make a good investment, you win. If you make a bad investment, you lose. That's what capitalism's all about. No one's here to give you a handout just because you make a bad decision. So, in a proper sort of sense, it would have been the German banks that took the hit. But of course, that's not going to be palatable to someone like Angela Merkel, who's looking for re-election as German Chancellor. So in her position of power, she can't have a fiscal stimulus. She can't accept that the Irish debts would want to be passed on to her banks, although perhaps rightly they should be. So again, it just sort of comes back around to pointing the finger at the peripheral nations and accusing them of being morally weak and morally weak and irresponsible with their money. So there's a certain hypocrisy there that needs to be exposed. Now, I think we'll have plenty of time to talk about this hypocrisy in future classes, and we'll do a lot more on this financial crisis in the coming weeks. But just to sort of wrap it up for today, my argument to you as someone who's been kind of studying and looking at the European financial crisis for some time now, especially in the context of Ireland, is that while clearly people like Angela Merkel have been hypocritical in their approach to the financial crisis, I think the much more interesting thing, the much more fascinating thing, is the relative ease with which elites have been able to call for austerity and to implement austerity policies in the peripheral countries. In Ireland especially. Now Greece is a different case because the Greeks really got angry, as you can see here in the slide. The Greeks got quite angry and really did protest quite a lot, and there's a lot to be said about that. But in Ireland, Spain, Portugal, I think there's been less demanded by way of accountability from the elites. In Ireland in 2011, for example, bizarrely, there was an election, and after 3 years of austerity, the Irish people switched from one conservative party to another, and both parties had been fairly committed to the maintenance of the European Union's austerity strategy. So, it's we can criticize austerity, and certainly austerity hurts, but what's interesting is how people can internalize these sort of self-loathing values, right? Some people would argue that this is a case of voluntary servitude. Now, of course, that's an easy accusation to throw, and in reality, okay, so say you did want to make a stand. What would that look like? Are you going to borrow a metaphor, throw your toys out of the pram? Are you going to just like quit the European Union and leave? Because owing all that money, it might not, there's no guarantee that life will be easier outside the European Union than it would be inside the European Union. I mean, that's certainly the kind of dramatic conundrum that confronted Ireland, that confronted Greece, um, in their efforts to think through what was confronting them, to what their situations were. Today, I think it's clear and safe to say that the bailouts have more or less worked, but at a terrible cost. I mean, Greece was brought to the brink of obtaining a second bailout, and many people believe that Syriza, its leftist party, which came to power after the crisis began, could and should have led the nation out of the eurozone together. As I was just saying about Ireland, some there were similar debates in Ireland as well. And that's just, I think it's got to be understood that those desperate kinds of conversations and decisions are being thought about. Those options are being thought about because the austerity is that bad. The austerity is something that this generation is bearing in an effort to refloat the economy, but it's also, I think, clear that it won't put a huge dent in the debt, and that the debt may sort of continue on for many years to come, in which case multiple generations may be burdened with austerity. And you have to ask yourself the question, as Mark Blythe does, are the real hypocrites here perhaps not more the European Union elites and managers and politicians who have called for this austerity, because they're trying to avoid having to confront going to the German voters and explaining to them the need for them to recognize that they were involved in this too, that it was their pension funds that created the glut of cash that flowed into Ireland and Greece and Spain that generated these big property bubbles in the first place. So we'll wrap it up here, I think, today, guys. Thank you for your time. It's been fun. I enjoyed this lecture, and hope to see you later this week. Then we will have our discussion boards, and I'll tune in and see how you guys are doing with those on Thursday. Thank you very much for your time. Drop me a line on Slack if you have any questions about this lecture, okay? Thank you.